I don't need to tell you that the world's a little unsettled right now. In Europe, there's major elections changing who holds the keys to power. In Britain, the majority wants Johnson gone. Around the world, COVID continues to impact daily lives, but that barely scratches the surface when it comes to global insecurity. That's right, because around the world, there's been a huge increase in coups, with governments being overturned across the globe. So in this video, we'll explain some of these incidents, why people around the world are choosing to overthrow their government, and why coups now seem to be back in fashion. So we're going to split this video into three parts. First, we're going to look at the modern history of military coups, how over the last 60 years or so the frequency of coups has steadily declined. Second, we're going to have a look at how this trend has dramatically reversed over the past 18 months or so, with there being more coups in 2021 than there were in the preceding 5 years combined. Third, and finally, we're going to do our best to explain this reversal. So let's get into the first part of this video, how the frequency of coups has changed over the past 60 years. The long and short of it is that from 1960 until 2020, coups became significantly less frequent. According to data from The Economist, the frequency of military coups globally has fallen by about 75%, from an average of about 12 a year in the 1960s to just about 3 a year in the 2010s. Coups also became less successful in the same time period. In the 1960s, your average military coup had a greater than 50% chance of succeeding. In the 2010s, the success rate was roughly half that, at about 25%. Now, explaining these trends is difficult, but research by One Earth Future, an NGO, found that there are essentially 4 good predictors for coup-related political instability. Number 1, the economy. If the economy is doing badly, and especially when it's in a recession, the risk of coup increases, simply because populations don't like being poor, and especially don't like being poorer than they were last year. Number 2, the weather. Apparently, rainier than average and drier than average countries have an increased risk of political instability, possibly because extreme weather correlates with food insecurity and poverty. Number 3, how long a leader has been in power. The longer a leader has been in power, the more likely a coup becomes, especially if they've stayed on after losing an election. And 4, how long since the last coup. Essentially, coups are more likely immediately following another coup, presumably because the political instability in the aftermath of a coup makes a counter-coup more likely. The data can help us explain why coups have become less common. Presumably, some of it has to do with the economy. In the past 60 years or so, global economic prospects have improved, and thanks to international economic cooperation via organisations like the IMF and World Bank, crippling recessions in developing countries have become less frequent, thereby making coups less likely. Similarly, the spread of democracy over the past 40 years or so has reduced the average government tenure, therefore reducing the likelihood of impatience-inspired coups. In 1977, Pew Research classified 62% of regimes as autocratic and just 25% as democratic. In 2017, those figures had flipped. 57% of regimes were democratic, 28% mixed, and just 13% described as autocratic. Somewhat paradoxically, this spread of democracy is in some part a consequence of successful pro-democracy coups. A 2014 paper in the British Journal of Political Science found that most coups since the end of the Cold War have been followed by elections within 5 years. Before we move on to the second part of this video, a final observation. According to the data, extreme weather events correlate with coup frequency. If climate change produces more extreme weather events, we should therefore expect to see substantially more military coups in the near future. Anyway, on to the second part of the video, the recent uptick in coups. So, as we mentioned, in the 2010s there were an average of about 3 coups per year, and just 25% of those were successful. In 2021, however, the 60-year trend reversed sharply. There were 8 coups, 9 if you include the storming of the capital on January the 6th, and 10 if you count the 2 attempted coups in Sudan, a month apart, as separate coups, 6 of which were successful. For context, in the 5 preceding years, from 2015 to 2020, there were 7 coups, just 3 of which were successful. UN Chief Antonio Guterres described an epidemic of coups. These coups were spread across the world. There was a semi-successful coup in Myanmar and a foiled plot in Jordan, but were, as usual, concentrated in Africa. 6 African countries experienced coups in 2021. There was a failed coup in the Central African Republic on January the 15th, another failed coup in Niger on March the 31st, a successful coup in Chad on April the 21st, a successful coup in Mali on May the 24th, a successful coup in Guinea on September the 5th, and a failed coup in Sudan on September the 21st, followed by a successful one on October the 25th. 2022 has already seen its first African coup in Burkina Faso, where the military, led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Damiba, ousted President Roch Kabore on January the 24th. So, on to the third part of this video. Why are coups back in fashion? To answer this question, it's probably worth looking back at Africa specifically, where most of the coups have occurred. Broadly, there seem to be 3 related but distinct reasons for the recent uptick. Number 1, a weakening of anti-coup norms, especially in the African Union. Number 2, the so-called new scramble for Africa means that coupists can always rely on support from somewhere. And number 3, democratic regimes have, so far, struggled to rebut African jihadists. So, the first reason, weakening anti-coup norms. In 2000, the Lomé Declaration banned military coups and established the norm of imposing sanctions on coupists, as happened with Mauritania in 2008 and Madagascar and Guinea in 2009. The declaration was signed by the Organisation of African Unity, the predecessor to the African Union. The Lomé Declaration was a great success. It reduced both the number of coups, there were 15 coups in the 10 years preceding the declaration, and how long the coupists took to give way to new elections. For context, the 15 coup-born regimes between 1990 and July 2000 spent a total of 306 months in power before handing over office to either a transitional or an elected government. An average of 20.4 months per regime. Compare this with the 114 months that the 10 similar regimes spent in power from July 2000 to December 2012, an average of 11.4 months. Unfortunately for Africa, this norm started weakening in 2017, when the African Union decided to essentially ignore Mugabe's ousting in Zimbabwe. The AU had been similarly reluctant to impose sanctions in Chad, and its inaction has apparently encouraged other coupists across Africa, who know that they're unlikely to face full-on sanctions. On to the second reason, the new scramble. Over the last few years, various superpowers have started exercising influence in Africa in what's been described as the new scramble for Africa. This has encouraged coupists because it means that they can be sure of support from somewhere. For example, coupists in Mali were supported by Russian mercenaries, and China has proved willing to lend money to basically anyone in Africa, or Myanmar for that matter. Previously, would-be coupists would have been deterred by the knowledge that, if they did try a coup, African Union sanctions, which usually also mean EU and US sanctions, would cripple their economy. Thanks to the new scramble, coupists now know that even if the West sanctions them, they can find support from some other opportunistic power. On to the third and final reason, jihadism in Africa. This is something we're considering doing a standalone video on, but the long and short of it is that Africa currently has a jihadism problem. Despite the biggest Western anti-terrorism operation since Afghanistan, France has deployed about 5,100 soldiers backed by commandos from America and other European countries, African jihadists have successfully expanded westward into Mali from Lake Chad, and are now moving south to the Gulf of Guinea. It's no coincidence that 4 of the 7 African countries to suffer an attempted military coup in the past 13 months are currently struggling against the jihadists, who have increased their attacks in recent months. Democratically elected governments have so far failed to slow the spread of African jihadism, which is why military leaders, who promise an end to jihadism and regional security, are actually pretty popular in some of these countries. Recent polling found that over 90% of respondents in Bamako, the capital of Mali, and about 50% of respondents in Burkinabe, the capital of Burkina Faso, approved or strongly approved of military rule. So that's why coups are back in fashion, especially in Africa. As a last thing, this is especially worrying because, as the data we looked at earlier demonstrates, coups breed more coups. As things stand, we can expect the current frequency of coups in the region to continue, or even increase, which is particularly bad news given the jihadist problem. So, anyway, what do you think? Do we expect to see even more, and is there anything we can do to end this vicious cycle? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers for making videos like this one possible, and if you want to see your name at the end of videos just like these people, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description below.